Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're so glad you could join us for today's webinar, On the Road to Accelerating Circularity. This webinar is the third in our series, Red, White, and What's New in Responsibly Made Fashion, and was organized by the United States Fashion Industry Association, representing brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the U.S. and doing business globally, as well as our friends at Lensing. My name is Shannon Brady. I'm the Communications Coordinator at USFIA, and I'll go over a few technical notes before we begin today. The first is that questions can be submitted at any time during the live presentation. Simply click on the question header on your webinar control panel, type your text into the box, and hit send. Our presenters will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. And if for some reason we experience a technical difficulty and lose audio, please refer to the chat box for further instructions. A quick reminder that all attendees will receive a follow-up email later today with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of today's session. So without further delay, I'd like to hand the floor over to our moderator, USFIA President Julia Hughes.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is going to be an exciting discussion with companies in the forefront of responsible fashion. As many of you know, the Accelerating Circularity Project released its first research report on how to develop circular supply chains. Developed through research, reports, and monthly working group meetings with key industry partners, the Research and Mapping Report aims to inform discussions about the opportunities and the gaps for circularity in its study of U.S. textile waste and supply chains. Accelerating Circularity Project is funded by a grant from the Walmart Foundation, as well as Gap Inc., Target, Nike, and VF Corp. USFIA is one of the supporting partners. So let's welcome today's presenters to the webinar. And first, Alice Hartley, Senior Manager, Sustainable Innovation at Gap Inc. Carla Magruder, Founder and Executive Director, Accelerating Circularity Project. Stephen Usdan, Co-Founder of Geotex. And Tricia Carey, Director, Global Business Development and Lensing, and our partner in this series. So we're going to start and let everyone introduce themselves first. So Carla, why don't you kick us off with an introduction?
Thank you, Julie. My name is Carla Magruder. I am the founder of Accelerating Circularity. I've been in the textile industry for many, many years, working throughout the textile supply chain from launching the first 100% annually renewable fiber, that was PLA, to working with fabric and garment companies. So the idea of getting into circularity really worked well for me, understanding the entire supply chain.
Thanks, Carla. Now, Alice.
Hi, so I'm with Global Sustainability for Gap Inc. I lead our work on product sustainability for the department and for the company. And so in that capacity, I work closely with our brands on their product-related sustainability initiatives, and then also closely with our supply chain internal business partners, and by extension, our mills and vendors in our supply chain on sustainability.
Thanks, Alice. So Stephen, you want to tell us a few words about yourself and Geotex?
Good morning. Thank you, Julie. My name is Stephen Usdan, and I've spent, like Carla, many, many years in the textile, in and around the textile business, including the fiber and spun yarn sectors. About 25 years ago, I co-founded Geotex, which is a textile waste to fiber to yarn recycling operation. We work within the industry to upcycle materials that are discarded in manufacturing and produce new inputs for the knitting and weaving markets.
Thanks, Stephen. And Tricia, would you like to say a few words about yourself and Lensing?
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Julie, for hosting our discussions during our series this month and next month. So my name is Tricia Carey, and I handle global business development at Lenzing, where we work directly with retailers and brands to support the development of our fibers, viscose, modal, and lyocell. We brand our fibers as Tencel for modal and lyocell, and as Lenzing EcoVero for viscose. Lenzing has a long history of lowering our environmental footprint and working towards innovative products that keep the environment in mind. Some of the projects that I work on involve supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially around SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, which has led me to work on many circularity projects and has kind of become a passion of mine. And also working within all of our partners, mills, spinners, as well as retailers and brands for SDG 17 around partnerships for the goals. So those are some of the things that I'm involved in, and I'm sitting today in our New York office, so it's very exciting for me to be in the office today.
Lucky you. Okay, so now we're going to turn this over to Carla, who's going to present the ACP report. It was released last week, right before World Circular Textiles Day on October 8th, and some of you, I think, joined us for our webinar that day too. So Carla, the floor is yours, and we'll shift to the slides now.
Great. Thank you, Julie. You know, I want to thank both USFIA and Lenzing because both of these organizations are great examples of companies who collaborate to get things done. If we move on to the slides, to the next slide, you know, Julie mentioned the great support we have by our brands, Gap, VF, Target, and a foundational grant from Walmart. But we also couldn't do this work without the expertise of these people. So not only have they been kind enough to fund us, but they've also provided their expertise in these monthly meetings. So the brands, in addition to Lenzing, Geotex, Green, and Unify, it really takes everybody to participate to get circularity off the ground. So if we move on to the next slide, we started the report to talk a little bit about circular basics, things like the fact that we need a common language. And so in the report, there's actually a list of definitions, you know, things as simple as like feedstocks. When we talk about feedstocks, we want everybody to know that we're talking about the raw material that gets fed into the machines or the processing plant. We need to make sure that everybody's using the same language. We also talk about big circles and little circles. I know that a lot of people use the term closed loop and open loop. I have a tendency not to like open loop very much because it doesn't sound circular to me. So I like to reference, you know, big circles and little circles. Little circles are where a company provides materials, it goes into a recycling system, and then it comes out and it goes right back to that same supplier, that same brand. Big circles, on the other hand, are where materials are sent to a supplier, multiple materials are sent to the supplier, and they're put into the recycling system, and then those materials come out and they can be purchased by a variety of people. So we're looking much more at things like a mass balance system. And the reason that we do that is because we believe that big circles are going to allow for scale. We really need to be able to have companies that are recycling, that are collecting and sorting work on significant volumes. And then we also talk about circular ins and outs. When we're talking about circularity and accelerating circularity, we talk very much about the systems. We really need to be looking at what goes into each step within the system and what comes out, and to make sure that those flows of materials, those flows of requirements meld with one another for us to really become circular. So if we move on to the next slide, this slide is just an image that we like to use to talk about our scope of work. So you can see in the bright purple there what the existing supply chain is, where it starts and stops. It starts typically with fiber companies and then goes through to the brand and retailer. We are working on a part of the system that hasn't been connected. It's that system, that part of the system that you see there in white. That's our primary area of focus. And again, the idea is to connect all of these dots, right? To connect the links that are going to allow for true circularity. We'll move on to the next slide. And so this is where our report starts getting into some detail. So we asked ourselves, what are all the questions you need to answer when we think about circularity? So Accelerating Circularity is focused on the East Coast of the United States. When we looked and started doing our research on what materials were available, the Environmental Protection Agency, you often hear this number, about 16.9 million tons of materials. That's throughout the United States. We went and we looked specifically what was going to be within our region. And so within our region, that's about 5.2 million tons that's available on the East Coast. 86% of that today goes to landfill. There's 14% that is diverted, and that diversion goes to 7% goes to reuse, 3.5% goes to wipers, and 2.5% goes to fiber and shoddy. Now, if we're talking about moving the industry to textile recycling, that's a number that we have to pay attention to, and how do we grow that number? And then 1% of what gets diverted eventually does end up going back into landfill. So I'm sorry these slides are so little, but if you look beneath that 86, the circle with the 86%, which is the most easily readable number on there, you can see that about 35% of materials going to landfill today, we believe, are likely to be able to be recycled. And that's based on the fact that those materials from our research are 100% cotton, 100% polyester, or blends of cotton and polyester without other restricted fibers. One of the most restricted fibers from our research is elastane. The problem with elastane is it's in so many different products. And so that really can cut down on the ability to recycle with our current technology and capabilities. There's about 45% of material that has the potential to be recycled. And this potential is based on the advent of better sorting technologies or advanced recycling technologies coming online. Some of these recycling technologies are coming to the fore now. Some of them that are still in the commercialization stages are doing testing and pilots to see if they're actually able to do what they say. So there's learnings going on in terms of what fiber contents actually can be recycled. And then there's about 20% that today, with the technology that we have, and even looking at some of the advanced recycling technology, we believe probably isn't going to be recyclable for some time. Those are materials that potentially have super high contents of things like elastane or potentially metal fibers, which seem to be a really big no-no in most recycling systems, or are very soiled, and so again can't be recycled within the current systems. So if we move to the next slide, we can see who's generating that 5.2 million tons. You know, if we look at post-industrial waste, it's an area that we think of frequently as someplace where we can get materials that can go into recycling. And because we're looking specifically on the East Coast of the United States, that material that's going to landfill today from post-industrial waste streams is relatively small. It's about 90,000 tons. The bulk of that is coming from fabric mills. One of the areas where post-industrial waste is often looked to for materials for recycling is cut and sew scraps. And that's not really within, there isn't a lot of that happening within our geographic scope. So the numbers on that are relatively small. So what we're really looking at is post-consumer waste. You can see there are two spheres there that is generated from consumers, things like hospitals, hotels, industrial laundries, and that's where the 5.2 million tons come from. So you've got the general number, you know, the what's in our area, then the amount that's diverted, and the 5.2 million tons that's specifically textile materials. So if we move on to the next slide. So the next question we asked ourselves is, how are we going to collect all this materials and how is it going to be sorted? So we have an interactive map on our website, and our website is acceleratingcircularity.org/research, and there'll be a slide later on that shows that. But this interactive slide, you can go on there and you can see who the collectors are. You can see that who the sorters are, who the pre-processors are. When it comes to collection, we believe that collection is going to be relatively easy to scale, so that it can meet the needs of recyclers and circular systems. Because as the demand grows, there are systems out there today that collect materials at relatively large scale. So nonprofit collectors, Goodwill, Salvation Army collect enormous amounts of materials. There are some for-profit collectors, companies like Savers, which are, you can see on these maps, that are also collecting. And then there are other systems, bin collectors, curbside collectors that are collecting materials. And the other thing that we're all know is starting to happen more and more is that brands and retailers are providing take-back programs. So these are some of the new options for collection. When it comes to sorting and pre-processing, that's a gap that we see and we found. There aren't a tremendous amount of sorting facilities and pre-processing facilities in the United States, and particularly in the East Coast region. There are actually some sorting hubs in places like Texas, and one also in Canada. The cost today, sorting and this pre-processing work is done very much by hand. That's very expensive. And so those services have moved, there have been a significant movement to lower cost countries. So this is an area where we need new technologies, we need automated sorting, and that will allow us to do this. So this is a gap that we feel the industry needs to focus on for circularity. And then on the next slide, we talk about how are we going to recycle these materials. The primary commercial opportunities today are mechanical recyclers. That's the kind of work that Stephen Usden is doing. You'll see globally, you can see the number of mechanical recyclers in both cellulosic and PET. When it comes to the USA, you know, the numbers obviously get much smaller, but it starts to show you what we can do in the United States, what's there, what's available. Next slide. And then, what are we going to make? If we're moving to circular systems, we better have a target for what it is that we want to make. So in the course of our project, we surveyed brands, retailers, and supply chain actors for products that are currently being made in the Western Hemisphere and those that were targeted for circularity. And what we found, the intersection of those products were denim, knit tees, home textiles, activewear, outerwear, and hotel linens. So these are going to be potential products when we move into the pilot phase of accelerating circularity. And then as we move to the next slide, who's going to buy this? Well, I mean, today, who hasn't made a commitment really to circular commitments? There are dozens of brands and retailers that have made commitments, including the use of 100% recycled materials by specified dates, depending upon which brand or retailer it was. And there are brands actually who are even investing in these advanced recycling technologies. So we feel strongly that the industry is committed to circularity, and that we're on the road to making it happen. But we still have a lot of work that we need to do. So as we move to the next slide, you can see that our next steps are really about asking everybody in the supply chain to participate. Accelerating circularity is all about the belief that collaboration is essential to accelerate the move to circularity. So we're asking brands and retailers to provide us with information on the fiber contents of their products. This is necessary so that we can start to standardize sorting and processing equipment. People need to know what's coming at them. For the collectors and sorters, we're asking them to standardize sorting grades so that the recyclers know what's available to purchase. And then the recyclers, they need to identify what it is that they need and classify themselves. What are the fiber contents that they can work with? What are the restrictions that they have? What are the quantities that they need to be commercial? Knowledge, as they say, is power. I believe that we have if we all work together, we will have the power to make the change that we need. So according to Nelson Mandela, it's always impossible until it's done. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carla. That was great. And that is also inspiring words to conclude on. So now we're going to have a conversation with the panelists, and I'm going to ask questions and let us start that dialogue, and then we'll be opening it up for questions from all of you in the audience. So let's kind of kick off with a question. So with all this data that was presented, I'm curious what each of you found the most interesting. And let's start with you, Stephen. What were the highlights for you in the report?
It struck me that the ecosystem that we were in, producers, consumers, disposers of material, it's very complex and very disconnected. There's a real gap between all of those functions, and especially on the post-consumer side. And I think that's our heavy lifting, to be honest. You know, I work in an area that is pre-consumer, and it's a fairly mature area. There's so much going to landfill, and there's no model around it at this time. I was really struck by the volume.
Yeah, I agree. Alice, what's your perspective on what you found most interesting?
For me, it was two things. One, just that number, that 35% of fabrics going out there are readily recyclable. I think having that in mind makes it really tangible and makes it look like something that we can start to think about. Okay, what can we do to make our fabrics more readily recyclable now that we have a better understanding of those parameters? And the second thing is just the availability of post-industrial scraps in that Southeast cluster around textile manufacturing. I think that's kind of a pleasant surprise, even though it's maybe a small volume overall. It starts to show us that there's these pockets where if we can set up the right links in the chain, that you could actually feasibly start to recover that material, and maybe that paves the way to doing it at a bigger scale with the post-consumer material.
That's great. Tricia. I think Tricia just disconnected herself. So how about we go to you, Carla? So, all right, it's your report, but what was there that you found that, okay, Tricia's back. Okay, Tricia, you're on mute, Tricia.
Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. First of all, I would have to say what's wonderful is actually that the report came out, because in such a short period of time, it's very impressive to me how much information through Carla's leadership and the rest of the team, we were really able to put together. And this focus on a specific geographic area was incredible. And similar to what Stephen was saying, and from our side, from Lensing, because we're on a chemical recycling point, what I found really interesting was the breakdown of what kind of waste is available. Because I think it allows us to look at where we're at now, where we need to go to, and how can we have more waste that is usable for a second life in the future. And I think when we can precisely start to analyze that, it helps us to have this baseline in order to go forward. And that's what we really need. We're at the beginning of trying to figure all of this out. For some technologies like mechanical recycling, as Stephen said, post-industrial, that already had a whole system on its own. But how do we look at the entirety of all this waste, of all the 16.9 million tons that we generate in the United States? And so this ability to then dissect it down into what can be used now, what possibly could be used, what's not usable. So that gives us a starting point. And then how can we start to shift from there? I found was really interesting. But I think overall, the fact that we were able to put this information together in less than a year, and the collaborations that it takes to do that is really incredible.
Thanks. All right, Carla, what surprised you?
I'm not even sure surprise is the right word, but one of the things that sort of really came to the fore for me was the incredible lack of data and the need for that data. And I've joked now, I tell people that sort of circularity and data are like husband and wife. It's not going to work without one or the other. I mean, they've got to work together. We really need the data to make this work. So it's surprising that there isn't better data in some areas than what we have today. And I think that's going to be a real area of focus for us as we move forward.
Thanks, that's perfect. So, looking at it slightly differently, okay, it sounds pretty simple, right? Let's use the waste to make new textiles, but actually it's much more complex. So let's maybe talk a little bit, what do you all see as the greatest challenge? And let's start with you this time, Alice, from a brand perspective.
Yeah, to me, I think the greatest challenge is just making it all work economically. It's not to say there aren't technical challenges, there still are, but I think does it work economically is a really key question, because we are talking about an ecosystem here, and what we are looking at is that several pieces of this puzzle all need to shift simultaneously for it to work collectively. So the textile recyclers, they need a higher proportion of high value recyclable materials to work with, and they also need end markets for the fibers that they want to sell. For us in the brands, we need clear specifications of what it means to be recyclable, and we also are looking for high quality fibers and yarns to become available at scale in order for them to be affordable. So those are the reasons I think the economic lens is just as important as any of the technical challenges that we're going to encounter in trying to bring this to life.
I think that's a great point. Carla, well, what do you see as the greatest challenge?
Well, I would agree with Alice. Financially, this all has to work. But the other thing that I think that she touched on, which is really important, is that so much of what needs to change has to change simultaneously. I got very tired of people saying, well, we've got to be careful about the chicken or the egg, what comes first. There is no chicken or the egg, it's just all got to happen. So if we're going to get to circularity, we really have to be able to get the system moving. And so that we can't move one thing at a time and think we're going to make progress. We have to move the entire system. And so we also have to understand the system to be able to get it to work.
What's your view, Stephen?
I'm in agreement with Carla and with Alice. You know, when we're talking about what to do with all of this material, we've already sort of lost the argument or lost the battle here. We need to change all at one time, and in alignment is really the key. So that if we're designing products at the front end that are going through the system, think of it as a system to come back around for recycling, to go back to manufacturing. Then we've solved it on the front end, then what we have to, or another test would be, what do we do with all of this above ground material that was created in the older model? So if we can get brands and recyclers and sorters to align on materials that can go through a system that we can define, starting from scratch, then we can actually create something that is sustainable.
Thanks. Okay, and Tricia, so from the fiber perspective.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many challenges to tackle, and I think some were already addressed. For lensing and what I've been working in, you know, since 2013, I've been talking about chemical recycling and how we can take scraps and make them into new fiber. And in 2013, people were like, really, you could do that? You can take old materials, take that cellulose and make it into something brand new and still have all of that same integrity. I think what I see that's missing now, because we've progressed to a point where there's at least a knowledge base within the industry. I think within this report, as Carla mentioned, we need to have clarity and definition of common language. But I see that we need to engage the consumer more, that they need to become a part of the solution. And we also need to work within legislation and what is the government doing, because this is how we're really going to accelerate the change. The report touches on some programs that are in New York City, some in Boston, but what else can we be doing from a legislative standpoint to accelerate, whether it's through incentives from tax reduction or just setting some standards, because this will what will really move the needle.
Thanks, and I definitely agree with that. I think that that's absolutely part of what we are hoping we can build on this in advocacy and looking at policy making here in Washington. I wanted to ask you all about one of the sections in the report on how it can be recycled. I thought that was really interesting, and I wonder, you know, maybe you all can share some perspectives on what's the best way to have an impact on recycling and what's missing. So maybe Carla, can you kick us off on that topic?
So, you know, there are, and, you know, this was a quick highlight of what's in the report. There's a lot more information on there. So there's, you know, Stephen's on the phone. He's doing mechanical recycling today. Tricia's doing chemical recycling. They're both in the cellulosic area. And we also, within our group, we have people who are working on chemical recycling of polyester and mechanical recycling of polyester. So how we recycle things are going to be dependent on the materials and the feedstocks that we have to recycle. But in addition to, you know, it seems, you know, fairly simple. Chemical recyclers, mechanical recyclers, we've got cellulosic-based materials, we've got polyester-based materials, but with even on top of that, there are significantly more details and issues that come into play that have to be addressed. There are things like color. You know, and Stephen, you can talk about that further, Stephen. You know, he works with a variety of colors, and, you know, that can have its pluses and minuses. Fabric format. Can someone take whole garments? Can they take parts of garments? Can they take knits, or they can take wovens? So how can we recycle is in itself a pretty big question.
Yeah. Tricia, do you have some, what is your thinking on this?
Yeah, and you know, this is where I thought in 2017 when we came out with Refibra, we had all the answers. And then more questions keep coming and more challenges. And when we came out in 2017, we were working with post-industrial waste. And then the brand said, well, but we really want post-consumer. And then we start to work on that. And we set up our goals. I think what we saw from the report and all the work that we did is also the amount of investment that's needed, because what we have here is the consumption and the disposal happening in one place, and often you have the production happening somewhere else. Now, for lensing, we're fortunate because we do have a production facility in Mobile, Alabama, so that's where we fit into the scope of this study. But we also see that more investment is needed within local recycling centers. As Carla mentioned, they're not always in the right spots. So how can we map this better to happen within the right geographic location of where the waste is, where the production is, at least to start to build new supply chains? And it can happen. We might only be missing, small parts of it. But this is going to take investment and funding in order to move forward.
Stephen, would you like to share your perspectives on this? This is close to your heart.
Well, the biggest challenge that we face is demand. We can recycle a lot of things, and we can make a lot of different products, yarn products for fabrication. We need brand partners to say we will include X amount, or we must have a portion of our production in these materials, and then the choice of that production has to align with the recycling technology. So chemical recycling and mechanical recycling have their flaws and benefits, and we have to be able to map those materials into products that can be accomplished and then further accomplished in this part of the world. So it's a pretty nuanced situation at the moment.
Okay. And Alice, what's your perspective?
Yeah, so what is missing? So I think what we are starting to understand better now about fiber composition is a great start. But you also can take a good fabric and render it bad for recycling by what you do to it later and adding prints or finishes, trims. So I think that's the next step of this work, is to better understand either what can be readily removed in the recycling process. So a question I get commonly is, can I put polyester sewing thread on a cotton t-shirt, and does that negate its recyclability, for example? Or if it's not that, then what does need to be avoided altogether? And today it's not totally clear enough what we need to do once we start to get into those more complex questions. And then just secondly, I think it's challenging that the future of what recycling technology will be able to handle feels like a moving target. So on the one hand, we really hope that the tolerance for blended fiber fabrics is going to increase, and that those will start to be considered readily recyclable. But at the same time, there's also some really interesting work being done right now. We're partnering with Hong Kong Research Institute of Textiles and Apparel on a project to figure out a method to remove spandex from blended fabrics. So if that's successful, then maybe does that change what these parameters are about what you can recycle? So, it's difficult when it's a moving target.
Thanks, that sounds great. So last question for us to discuss here before we open it up to questions from the audience. And that's, we all realize that improvement in circularity requires collaboration, and there are several initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about what's different about Accelerating Circularity project, and what is the call to action here? And let's kind of kick this off with you, Tricia.
With Accelerating Circularity, when Carla first mentioned it to me and said, this is what's missing, and it's not really being properly addressed. And I thought Carla was going to go to Italy and go into retirement. However, she decided to tackle this head on, but doing it in such a way from her experience of knowing how other organizations work and the pros and cons and what we needed at this moment. And I think what makes Accelerating Circularity different is that it's a smaller group. So we're very agile in order to move forward. It was very specific in the target of what the goals are to a specific region. But most importantly, I think it's about people coming together. Yes, our companies give us the platform. Because I work for Lensing, we can bring something to the table. But it's all of us as individuals and moving towards that target. So it's not just about the companies. And I think that's what's made accelerating circularity different in order to achieve. And yet we're doing, some great work and still collaborating with other initiatives that are related to circularity, because it all does tie in together within the ecosystem.
Alice, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, to me, what's different and has been most compelling is this singular focus on the US, starting with the East Coast. Because if we can start to look at this post-consumer waste stream, not as waste, but as a resource, we're sitting on this almost untapped source of raw material. And it's just exciting to think about what could we do if we can get our hands on it. And we also know that circularity has advanced so much faster in Europe than it has in the US. Everything from incentives to investment to policy levers. And so the focus here, frankly, will allow us to just do some catching up and learning from what's been done in other places. So if all of that put together can help us start to create a regional closed loop in the Americas, that'll really be a shift in how these materials flow from the kind of global pool that circulates now to more of a targeted Americas focused cycle is what we're aiming for.
Stephen.
Carla said earlier that the data was the big takeaway. The data was missing. What's different about ACP is that Carla doesn't accept it can't be done. So she is pushing everyone, challenging to get something done. So this is where we go from data to action. And ACP is modeling and will be doing production in this part of the world through recycling and demonstrating in real terms to brands and stakeholders that this is possible. There are limits. We need to learn what they are and be able to communicate them. But we're going to make a model that can be built on, and it's an endeavor that is dedicated to spreading that information out.
Thank you. And I agree, leadership is so important in what we are going to accomplish. So let me turn it over to Carla to kind of wrap up the answer to this question and maybe talk a little bit about call to action.
So what I would say is really different about accelerating circularity is the fact that we have so many people helping us. Our working group, I think a lot of initiatives out there, we come together on a monthly basis, right? And then I also pester everybody outside of that working group as well for information. And even people in our collaborating organizations like, Julie, I've called on you and other collaborators. So I think that really taking the idea of collaboration serious, really serious. People talk about it, and I don't think that they actually live it enough. And I think that we really believe that at Accelerating Circularity, we can't do this alone. So our call to action is absolutely participate, join with us, share information, help us build the data. The Accelerating Circularity website I mentioned earlier is acceleratingcircularity.org/research. You can go on there and provide some information, comment on things that allows you to do that. And there are still surveys that are open. If you haven't ever actually gone in and filled out the brand and retail survey, those are also on the website. So it's really about getting everybody to participate, and that's the serious call to action. Participate.
Thank you. Thanks to you all. This has been a great discussion, and now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and Shannon's going to come back on and share with you some of those questions.
Thank you, Julie. And yes, we will open it up now to our audience for questions. We'll start with those submitted during the live presentation, but we encourage all attendees to continue submitting questions using your dashboard. And our first question is that post-consumer waste is a huge part of the puzzle. Have there been or will there be an effort to market Accelerating Circularity's efforts to connect with the consumer?
I saw Tricia reach for her
Well, I mean, I think because this was one of my points about educating at the consumer level, I think through the commitments of the brands, that's one way that we'll be able to make that connection to the consumer. But and Carla, you can certainly comment on this more of where you see, will we be able to get into any programs that are happening on a local level? We participated in some of the discussions around circular cities in New York City, where there have been quite a few programs put together. But maybe Carla, you want to comment on that further?
We have the brands, and they have a direct reach to the consumers. We also have been in conversation with some municipalities and talking to them about what their textile programs are. And so we believe that that's another reach to the consumer. But I think that the consumer piece is one that is best in the brand's hands or through municipalities. And we are someone that can help provide information to make that link stronger. But it's not a direct link for us. Alice, this is a good question for you.
Yeah, what I would add to that, I think what the brands first and foremost can do is just work to increase the awareness of the facts around textile disposal and the very small amount of recycling that does take place today. I think it still is surprising to a lot of people when you tell them that 85% of what gets discarded is going to be going into landfill or incineration. I don't think there's wide awareness around that. So I think it starts with awareness and then helping to open the door and provide access to solutions. But that's where I do think brands can't do that alone either. I think the partnership with municipalities is really important so that it can get the widest reach possible.
Great, thank you very much. Our next question is, do any of the panelists have examples of state or local policies in the U.S. that support the needs for collectors, sorters, and recyclers?
So the city of New York, since Trisha's in there and we're on the East Coast, they actually work with collectors and sorters. They work with nonprofits because it's a way for them to help the nonprofits get materials that they can use in the store so that they have so that in a sense the nonprofits have a business case. So that's an example of a municipality doing something that supports textile collection and also supports nonprofits.
I was looking in my notes to make sure I got this right. I believe in Los Angeles that there's a goal to divert 90% of the waste stream from landfill by 2025, but I don't know enough about how that specifically translates into textiles and if there's parts of that mandate that call out that fraction in particular.
I think you can tell by the lack of a lot of vibrant information about policy that there isn't a lot of policy, and as it was said earlier, I think by Trish, that we really need stimulus to make this. We're all paying a price. It's just it's a hidden price, and so using the correct policies to shift costs would create opportunities, create incentives, and sort of align all of us together, leading with the consumer.
I mean, I just want to add, I do think that this is an issue for advocacy and policy discussions next year. Depending on what happens on November 3rd, that there may be certainly from the congressional side more interest in having this conversation than we have had lately. But I agree, that would be ideal to expand the conversation.
And we actually we polled a number of municipalities. So there are other municipalities that are also looking at textiles. Textiles is actually, for a lot of municipalities, a pretty big percentage of municipal solid waste. And so as they're looking to reduce that, textiles pops out as a particular issue.
Yeah, and I think we also need to look at what is being done in other product categories, whether it's recycling with bottles. California recently passed legislation for 15% of bottles to have recycled content by 2022. And I think it's 50% by 2030. So if we could also mirror what's happening in other recycled products in order to raise that awareness and to further the cause on textiles.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add to that, I think what makes textiles a little bit different is there is potentially really valuable material in that stream. So we're not talking about old paint or mattresses or some other things that are hard to recycle and causing a disposal burden on municipalities. There's real value there if we can just keep it clean and dry and going to the right place.
And I think actually this is sort of an interesting conversation because we do have other models, not just in other materials, but we have models in what's going on in other countries. Europe has the 2025 directive in the European Union that they will, every member state will have to collect textiles separately as of that date. And then there are additional policies being looked into. EPR schemes that already exist in France. I think Sweden has an EPR scheme. So there are models for us to look at when it comes to policy. There is some conversation already within the European Commission about requiring a percentage of materials even in textiles and clothing.
Great, thank you very much. We actually have a sort of similar question, and Alice, you mentioned, and Carla, just now you mentioned as well, that circularity in the EU is so much more advanced, and it's particularly due to different governmental programs being put in place there. Are there currently any federal or state incentives or grants that could help further the wonderful work of accelerating circularity?
We were actually just invited to invite-only session in California. I know that they're trying to do some good work. There is conversation. This has been a tough year for everyone because of COVID. And so maybe some of the work that might have been pursued might not be happening as fast as it would have otherwise. But we hope that we'll see more of this in the coming years.
Great, thank you very much, Carla. And our next question, we're a brand early in our journey of exploring circularity, and it's hard to know where to start. Between accelerating circularity, the Ellen MacArthur Fund, Fashion for Good, and Fashion Positive, where should we start?
I'll give my 2 cents on that question. I would say the best place to start is in education. I think the challenge and the mindset shift for designers is to start thinking about what's going to happen to that product once the person I intended it for is done with it, and where's it actually going to go. So I know it's hard to do field trips right now, but if you can search on YouTube for some virtual tours of a recycling facility, make all your designers watch that and learn more about what happens when textiles are sorted and what it means to recycle them. And I think those lights will start to go off about what decisions you're making on the input side that make it hard or easy to recycle on, on the end of life side. And then I think the guidelines themselves start to look less intimidating once you put yourself in the shoes of the recycler. Then I think those pieces will fit together better.
I think that was a great
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Carla, go ahead.
I think that was a great answer because I don't think that, all of these organizations that were mentioned, they all do something different and they work very differently. And so that education that Alice was talking about, I think that's really your first step.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else have any views they wanted to share? Okay, great. So we'll give attendees another minute or so to submit any last questions that they have. But Carla, I wanted to ask where people can go for more information on accelerating circularity.
Well, the website is the easiest place to go to look for information. www.acceleratingcircularity.org. The /research is where you can find a download of the report. There's also the interactive maps there, which I think would be really interesting for a lot of people when they want to find out more detail. And then there's a page that's, it says intelligence, and there's lots of information available there for people to come and to learn. We have definitions. There's definitions in the report, as well as definitions on the website. So I think that these are all areas that we'll continue to work on and expand.
Thank you very much. And we got one last attendee question, actually two more. The first is that, are there any books that you can recommend on this subject for a brand or retailer to read?
I don't know if you would start off with Cradle to Cradle, Michael Bromgart's book. And I think that's a basis for where a lot of discussions started in the early days. But I don't know, Carla or Stephen or Alice, if you have others.
There's some great books on textile waste and the journey that textile waste takes. And oh gosh, I can't even remember. Stephen, you talked about that book a while ago, and then I went and read it. But if you go and you Google textile recycling or textile waste, there are a couple of books. Most of them are well written. Gosh, I wish off the top. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name.
We'll share it with you, with whoever asked the question later. Once you remember the name, we'll share it.
Yeah. And lastly, how can you get involved from an organization's perspective?
I would say if you're. Go ahead, Stephen.
If the question is being asked from a brand or from a manufacturer, I think we would all love to engage with a purpose-driven program where we can engage with the brand to design product and go through a particular recycling system. Wherever it's produced, can come to the US and be recycled here, and define the collection, the material, the collection, and the final home for the material. I think that would be a useful exercise.
So I would say that people that wanted to get involved with the work that we're doing, reach out. We're pretty easy to find. And, depending upon what part of the supply chain that you're in, there's plenty of work for all of us to do. And typically we have lots of questions and, lots of requests. So if you're interested, reach out and I think you can get in touch with us on, there's an easy way to do that on the website. That's the easiest way to get in touch with us.
Oh, I was muted. Thank you very much. And we can also follow up after the webinar as well. On that note, we are going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much for participating, and a special thank you to Lenzing for sponsoring our Red, White, and What's New in Responsibly Made Fashion series. Our next webinar in the series will be in November, featuring an exciting discussion with the Transformers Foundation. More information will be available soon at USFashionindustry.com. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions. You can always contact USFIA directly by emailing us at info@usfashionindustry.com. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you at the next USFIA event.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye-bye.